Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to today's webinar, which is all going to be about working with layers. So that's the plan today. So we're going to start off nice and simple. Just look at different ways to draw layers. So with using a pen or a brush, for example, using gradient mask, using radial mask, luminosity masks, and all kinds of other stuff that we can fit in as well. Now today is special as, excuse me, not only are we broadcasting internally into our webinar system for those of you that have signed up, we're also going out on Facebook and YouTube as well. So there is rather a lot of you, so we try and manage that as best as possible in terms of comments, questions, and so on and so forth. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things to discuss. So the maximum time we have today is 60 minutes, so we won't go longer than that. As usual, we are recording the webinar. And the recording, if you're on Facebook, it will just pop up on Facebook straight away. And we'll also put a recording up on YouTube as well. And those of you who've signed up to the webinar will get an email when the recording is available. And also those of you on YouTube and Facebook, you'll be able to find the recording for this up on YouTube, and of course all our other webinars as well. Now, those of you watching internally on the webinar system, you're very welcome to submit your questions anytime. We'll talk about that at the second. Those of you commenting on Facebook and YouTube, I'll do my best to keep an eye on those as well. And of course, you're very welcome to enjoy the chat amongst yourselves as well. For those of you in the webinar system, the chat is the first tab which you'll come across. That's public, of course, so everybody can see what's going on in there. If you want to ask a question, it's best if you restrict that to the Q&A tab. And that just keeps that separated out from the chat. It's just much easier to find. We've also got my colleague Andre inside the webinar as well, so he can also help deal with any sort of questions that come up as well that aren't perhaps related to today's session as well. Now, if chatting and anything else is not interesting for you, then you can hide that and then give you a bit more real estate as well. So, without further ado, let us begin. So, as I said, what we're going to look at first of all is just the basic premise of working with layers. What does it actually mean? I'm going to assume you guys don't know much about layers, for example. So we're just going to take this right from a beginner standpoint. And then once we've dealt with the basics and really what it's all about, then we look on to other things like using gradient masks, for example. Let's zoom back out. Using radial masks as well. And then we move on to some more sophisticated stuff like flow control, which helps you create better masks. Using luminosity masking as well to do very specific masks on areas based on luminosity. And then if time allows, we can talk about using layers on a style and also how to incorporate your color grading into a layer as well. So it's a very big subject, layers, but it's definitely one of the best features in Capture One and kind of just adds an extra dimension to every other tool and makes everything a lot more flexible as well. So first of all, you need to know how to create layers and use them and so on. And what you'll see is in the top kind of 3 tool tabs up here in the default workspace, you may of course customized it, but in the default workspace, you'll find the layers tool, which is where you create layers, draw masks, and all the other things that you're going to learn today. Now, the reason why it's stuck to the top of these 3 tool tabs is that those are the tool tabs which kind of make the most sense of where to incorporate your layers. So that's in the color tool tab, the exposure tool tab that I'm on now, and also the details tool tab. Now you can customize the workspace however you like, of course, but that's kind of where it makes sense. All right, so what is a layer? Let's get rid of me first of all. So the simplest way to create a layer and kind of explain what it does is to draw it with a brush. So if I just grab this draw mask brush for a second and just draw, and if I press M on my keyboard, you'll see the kind of mask shape I'm drawing. By default, the mask is shown as red, and you can see as I started to draw, layer 1 pops up like so. And if I hide my mask with M, then essentially any adjustment that I now pull, whatever that may be, now is only affecting that particular area. So that's the general premise of a layer. So now that's layer 1, and we can have up to 16 different layers. That's the maximum. Very unlikely you're going to need to use more than 16. Normally 3 or 4 does the job. So each layer has a mask, and then wherever the mask is shown in red by pressing M on my keyboard, that's essentially where those adjustments are going to take place. So let's get rid of that crappy mask by hitting minus, and we do something actually useful as well. So I'm going to hide my browser, Command B, let's zoom in a little bit, and then look at what we can do here. So if I go to my Details tool tab, let's think of a practical example. So right now, of course, I have turned off the sharpening on all of the image. This is a very sort of, if you like, low, shallow depth of field shot. So maybe it doesn't make sense to apply sharpening over the whole photo. So we could restrict it in just one spot. And this is the, the most basic way to use layers and masks. So I'm going to grab a brush, move over to my photo. Let's make a layer first, and let's call it Smoothie, so we know what it's doing. And right click shows me my brush settings. Now right now we're just going to deal with the first top 2 sliders. So that's the size of the brush, fairly obvious to understand, and its hardness. So that's, if you like, the softness of the edges. So the reason why it has 2 circles is very simple. So the inner circle is where the opacity is at 100%, and then by the time we've got to the edge of the outer circle, it's faded off to 0. So that kind of gives you the impression of how hard or soft your brush is. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, like so, and then we're just going to draw a very sort of basic mask like so here in the middle. Now once again, if I want to hide that mask, that's M. And now we can use any adjustments to do what we want just on that layer. So I'm going to bump up the sharpening like so. And I'm also going to go to my exposure tool tab, and we're going to add a bit more clarity. You can see it's only affecting where I've masked. And then let's just open up the shadows a little bit so it doesn't get too contrasty like so. Now if I turn this layer off, then you can see before and after like so. Now the good thing is, if you want to brush this in anywhere else, let's go down here for example, then I can just start painting, and then magically, of course, that adjustment pops up in that spot as well. Now let's zoom back out, M on my keyboard to see the mask, like so. So there we go. That's, if you like, your first lesson in very simple mask drawing and applying an adjustment to that. Now, if we look over here in the Layers tool, we can see those shortcuts that I've been using. So M to turn the mask on and off. And with regards to shortcuts, we'll cover that a bit later, because everything we do with layers is available as a shortcut. So adding new layers, changing brush sizes, all kinds of stuff. Now, the reason why I'm not going to use them today is that it would make it very difficult for you to follow what was going on. So at the end, I'll show you where to find the shortcuts and how you can customize them as well. So there's an interesting option here called Display Grayscale Mask. So we're going to look at that, and then you need to hold a thought for later on. So the grayscale mask kind of obliterates the photo and just shows you where the mask is. Now we can see in this area, white, this is where the mask is at its strongest, maximum opacity, and the full effect of the adjustments will be shown. Where it's black, there is no mask. Now right now, when we drew this mask, so if I right click, when we drew the mask, we had these 2 adjustments, opacity and flow at 100. So the mask is either masked or not masked. There's nothing in between, okay? So that's why we see black and white on our grayscale mask. Now hold that thought, because later on we're going to see how you can vary the opacity of your mask to make the adjustments much more flexible. So what's next? Let's have a look at this shot. So drawing a mask with a brush, very simple and straightforward. That's going to get more sophisticated as we move through. So draw mask, erase mask, gradient mask. Now this shot here already has some underlying adjustments. You can see the exposure is brought down a bit. Actually, let's edit it so you can see what's going on. So let's grab our straighten tool and just straighten up the horizon. Let's get rid of me for a second so we can see what's going on. And let's hide our crop marks. Now it's a bit bright overall, so let's bring the exposure down. Let's also bring the brightness down a little, add some more contrast, and also add a bit of clarity. So I'm happy with the density of the foreground, if you like, but for me, I want to make that sky a bit brighter. Now what we could do, of course, is like what we just did with the first example, is grab our brush, and then we could mask happily away in this area, if you like, but we can accelerate that and do that much faster with a gradient mask. So with our gradient mask tool, you'll notice the icon looks a little bit different. So if we start drawing from the top, and you can see how the mask is going to look, it's going to gradually fall off as we come down the photo. Now, if I want to keep that nice and straight, shortcut key, I can hold down Shift, like so, and that will keep it nice and straight. Now, if I press M, it's going to hide the mask, and now we're free to adjust exactly what we want, for example, and it will only affect that area. Now there's a handy little additional thing that we can do with the gradient mask, is to change it from symmetrical to asymmetrical. So right now you see these three lines. They simply mean that the first line the mask is at 100%. By the time you reach the middle, so around here, we're at 50%. And by the time we get to the third line, we're at 0. So that's how the mask falls off. And by default, it's symmetrical. Now, if we want to make it asymmetrical, we can hold down our Alt key, and then we can move this line up or down, like so, and that will change the fall off so it's not completely symmetrical, like so. So now I can move the gradient like so, and then I have a stronger fall off, which you can see if I press M. Now, if you want to rotate the gradient mask, you can just go in the middle and spin it like so. And if you hold down Shift, you can also make the outer lines move closer or further away from the center. So a couple of handy shortcuts to modify that. Now the nice thing is about the gradient mask is that it's dynamic. So if I make some adjustments and I feel I didn't quite get it in the right place, I can just move back over to the shot and then just change its position like so, or make it more or less with the fall off and so on. Now you'll notice what happened. I didn't create a layer before I drew that gradient mask. So that's a default behavior. So if I start drawing a gradient straight away, you'll see Capture One creates a layer for me like so. If you like, you can create that layer yourself beforehand, but you don't need to. Now, important thing is, with our gradient mask and radial, as you'll see in a minute, you can only have one on each layer. So if I wanted, let's say, another gradient mask somewhere, if I started to draw it, say, from the bottom up, then that would actually overwrite my previous gradient. So if I wanted two gradient masks, I'd have to make another layer. Always name your layers. So this one is the sky, and then this one would be the ground, like so. And then I would be free, if I get the right tool, to draw the second gradient mask. So just be aware of that. It's only one gradient per layer. Okay, let's have a quick look at questions. Now I'm looking at, first of all, we're going to look at questions on the webinar, and I'll just pick out a few common ones. We won't necessarily be able to answer everything as we're very busy today. Layers work with most tools, but black and white is an exception, Jonathan is asking. Yes, and a good way to see which tools are available is as soon as I'm on a layer, if you look to the right of the tool name, there's a little paintbrush icon, and that means it is layer compatible. So the exceptions are the black and white tool, the vignetting tool, which you don't need because you have the radial mask, and also the film grain tool. That's only possible to work on the background. So you will see a few differences like so. Cool. Let's see. Ed asked the same question, so that's good to know. Frederick, we're going to talk about rasterizing a layer on a mask. So we get to that when we talk about luminosity masking. Can I have a gradient mask in just the middle of the image? Barry was asking. Not quite. It's always gonna start at the top. So if we press M, you can see that it always starts at the top. What you can do, Barry, if you want to, you can right click and say rasterize, and that will stick the mask as it is. So if we say rasterize, there's my mask, and I can now grab my erase brush and erase a bit of the top. Now I know that's not an ideal solution, but if I erased a bit here and held my shift key down and clicked over here, that's going to draw me a straight line. So it's kind of a workaround, but I agree it's not the best workaround. Okay, I think that deals with those particular questions. Just seeing on YouTube, are we going to go over heal layers? If we get time, then yes as well. So I shall try to remember to do that. Okay, next example. Kind of similar to the gradient mask, except it's now radial mask, so circular. So very similar principle once again. Let's just hide my face to get some space and grab the radial mask like so. Now you'll see the icon again is slightly different. So I'm going to start drawing this, and then you can see the mask that is being created. And really similar before. So those three lines, 100% on the outside, 50 in the middle, 0 by the time we get to this one. Now this cannot be asymmetric, it can only be symmetrical. But the fall off is so nice it doesn't tend to matter too much. Now, similar principles again before. If I hover in the middle, I can rotate my radial. If I go to the edge, then I can change the feathering like so. I can change the shape by pulling on any of those 4 handles that you see around the outside. Now again, if I move off the photo and press M, I can hide the mask, and then we can change any adjustment, as you can see, to affect just that masked area. And it's dynamic, so if I want to, I can always go in, whoops, let's undo that, always go in and then edit my mask as I see fit, like so. So super simple premise. Now by default you would have seen that when I drew the mask, that the mask is obviously around the outside. So I've pressed M on my keyboard so you can see the mask in red. Now if you want the opposite, then you can do a couple of things. You can either grab the outer circle and snap it inside, and then that will form the mask in the center, like so. Or you can right click and change the default behavior so your masks will always be inside. Or thirdly, you can right click on a layer and say invert mask. So then that will just, if I say invert, then you'll see it change. Doesn't look pretty, but you get the idea of what's going on. Cool. So again, very simple to see those various different options. Okay, let's just have a quick check on questions. And yes, Brian, you can use the eraser to remove parts of that gradient layer as you saw, but you have to rasterize it first. And we'll look at rasterizing again, but remember these masks are dynamic. So the radial mask, the gradient mask, or the linear, I would say, they're dynamic, so I can always go back in and retrospectively change it, move it around and so on. If I want to fix it as it is and say erase a bit, then I have to rasterize it. Okay, let's move on. So those are the 3 kind of basic ways to draw a mask with a brush, gradient or linear gradient or radial gradient as it's correctly called. So what can we do to kind of up the game a little bit? So we're going to talk about using flow, and we're going to look at a couple of different ways to incorporate flow. So here's a photo here. Let's zoom in a little bit. And again, it's had a few base adjustments. So if we option click reset, you can see before and after. So let's do that again. So before and after. It's just been brightened a little bit and opened up somewhat. But what I want to do, I want to open up this area a little bit more. I just want to brighten this part because it's slightly too dark. I can't really see what's going on. So you could think, well, David, just use the black slider and let's lift that, for example, which I can do. But you see, look, if I do this, kind of doesn't look very realistic. It's got that fake looking HDR effect going on. All I really want to do is just kind of brighten this zone a little bit. So just kind of around the hut here and there, for example. So it'd be nice to restrict the adjustment to that spot, which we can do with a mask, as you've seen. But this time, so it doesn't have that nasty fake look going on, we want to be a little bit mindful about the kind of mask we create. Now, if you remember with our smoothie glass, we just had this one. So if I do Option M, so remember it was a very binary mask. It was either masked or not masked. So now what we're going to do is go sort of somewhere in between, as it were. And we do that by using flow. So 2 different ways I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the way I used to do it and the way that I do it now, which I think has more advantages and gives you a better result. But I'll show you both and then you can pick and choose. So we want to kind of edit this area. And I know that by using the black slider, this is kind of going to give me the result that I want. So I'm going to just bring the black up to something around 50 points, like that. So I think that's probably going to be all right. Okay, so remember 50 points is probably about right. So what I'm going to do is make a new layer, and we're going to call this blacks. Blacks. Helps if you can type. And I know probably around 50 to 60 was going to be good. Now I'm going to grab my brush, going to go over to the shot. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see what's going on. Let's make it a bit softer and a bit smaller. And now we can start painting in that adjustment. Now, right now, opacity and flow are at 100%. So if I start brushing this in, or let's hide my mask, you can see it's not really looking that great. It's an all or nothing adjustment. So that's no good. So let's start again. So I can right click and say clear mask. It'll still keep my black adjustment. And we can go over, right click and pull this slider down. So to something around 5%, sorry. Just had to mouse over to something else, around 5%. So what's this going to do? So at 100%, as soon as I drew my mask, it gave me the full 52 points of black straight away. By reducing flow, this is like cutting the paint flow down on your paintbrush, if you like. It's going to now build up in 5% increments. So every time I draw over the photo, it's going to give me 5% of my adjustment here, 52. So as I go back and forth, it will be 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on. So now I can brush here gradually, and the mask is going to look sort of very weak. And then if I need to do more elsewhere, then I can do so. And if I felt I've gone too far, I can just grab my erase brush, and then I can take a little bit out where I want. Now, if the effect is coming in too quickly, then we can do a couple of things. We can turn down flow to be something even lower, or we can turn our adjustment down. And then we can brush again like so. So now if we look at our mask, so if we press M, you can see the red mask like so. If we turn the layers on and off, you can see the effect it's having like so. Now if we look at our grayscale mask, we can see what it looks like. So the brightest areas is where the adjustment is having the most effect, and the dimmer areas are where it's having the least effect. So we can be a lot more subtle and moderate our adjustments to a higher degree. And I can even take the opacity down on the layer to anything from 0 to 100%. And then gradually sort of brush this in where I think it needs it, maybe a bit more there, and so on. And if I've overcooked it, then we can take it down to where we think it looks good. So that's one method of using flow. Now, before you ask, and it might well be on the questions, why not use opacity? Well, opacity can stay at 100, in my opinion, because I can always reduce the overall effect by changing the opacity on the layer. What I'm interested in is watching the photo and seeing how it changes as we build up the mask by brushing backwards and forwards. Now I saw something flash past, why wouldn't I use shadows? I could do probably in this state, and we'll talk about this in a second, shadows might also work, but this is like the deepest tones, which is what only the blacks affect, so I think it gives a better result. But hold that thought, that was Craig, I think, because we can do a better version in a second. So just looking at the questions, just looking at the Q&A, 1 second. Can you paint on the grayscale mask? You can, Carl. So if we look at the grayscale, that's a good question actually, and think, you know what, there's a little bit of a hole here. I could just do that if I wanted to. Or I can see, well, that maybe that's a mistake. I can grab erase and then we can take that out. Now, a crucial thing about brushing and erasing is to have this one checked. Sorry, link brush and eraser settings. So that means when I flick between brush and eraser, these settings are identical. So I can add and take away at the same rate. Or you can have completely different eraser settings, but I wouldn't recommend it. Hope that answers your question, Carl, for example. Alex, who is on Facebook, says how to copy specific layers and masks. We're going to get to that. So don't worry, Alex, we shall cover that. And just checking a few other questions as well. Okay, I think we're covered for the general public questions, and let's have a look. Okay, what's the better way to do it, I think? So we're going to get rid of that layer, and this is a technique which I think works much better because the previous technique kind of relies on a bit of guesswork, which is never good, and also it's harder to see what a combination of adjustments might do, because that was only the blacks, and who was it? It was Craig, I can't remember who said that why didn't I use the shadow slider? So let's do this in a different way. So I'm going to start by adding a new layer type, which is called a filled layer. So if we add a filled layer and I press M on my keyboard, that shows me that the whole photo has a mask on it. So it's kind of like an adjustment layer in Photoshop. So now whatever I do, it's going to affect the whole photo. So now we can kind of experiment with adjustments to see what's going to fix this area the best. So we could do blacks. Yep, that kind of does a good job. We could look at what the shadows do. See, that's kind of affecting more. It's affecting the grass down here as well. But I know if I use the blacks, I can be pretty sloppy with the brush without, even if I overspill onto the grass, it's really not affecting it at all. So it's nicely targeted to that area. So Craig, I'm not going to use shadows, sorry. But I'm going to open up the blacks a bit, and then as it's getting maybe a bit flat, I could actually add some additional clarity just to that section as well. And what else do we need to do? I think that's probably good. So blacks and a bit of clarity satisfies me. Now, right now, this is happening over the whole shot, which is what I don't want, or at least in this triangle. So let's call this the cabins or whatever. Cabins blacks again. And I'm happy with the combination of clarity and blacks is going to do a nice job once I decide where I want to have it. That's the crucial thing. So what I need to do is right click and say clear mask. So that's going to get rid of the mask, but it's going to keep my clarity adjustment and my black adjustment intact because I know that was about right. Now, once again, I can grab my brush and we can go in. Let's just make this a bit bigger, probably zoom in a touch, just so you guys can see a bit better. And what's our flow set to? 3, nice and low. So now I can just brush in gradually and really focus where I want to have this area. Now, I'm not care if I brush over here by accident because the adjustments aren't affecting that. If I'd use shadows or exposure, then it would have ramped that up. So this is just allows me to be a little bit more carefree as well. And if I want to make this smaller with the right click, we could have a bit more just on that side of the cabin and so on. Dan, who was asking, said, how did you do the grayscale thing? You can find it here, Dan, display grayscale mask, or we can do the shortcut option M. So now you can see what the mask looks like. That's the side of my hut, for example. So if we turn the layer off, we can see before and after, nice and subtle. If I think it's too much, I can just dial that back. Now I feel that's a much better technique because I can combine more than one adjustment, blacks and clarity, in this case, mental block. We can visualize what's going on, and then we can use flow to bring it up to a level that looks good. Now, the next example is also a good example of exactly why this works nicely. So we got a lovely shot here from my buddy Damon out in Qatar. This isn't in Qatar, but he is. Just going to get rid of the viewer labels for a second. Little tip, if you need to brush kind of close to the outside of the picture, you'll see as soon as I get here, the cursor is going to change and I won't be able to brush. If we turn this guy on, then that gives us the proof view, as it's called, which gives us a bit more space around the photo, as you can see. Now this already has some base adjustments. If I option click reset, you can see before and after, like so. So it's just been warmed up a little bit, a few exposure changes, but I feel that there's more to gain in the sky, as it were, because I think there's some nice clouds going on. So I can bring that back with an adjustment layer, but the rest of the shot I think looks good. So I'm going to make a new filled layer. Let's call this sky, like so. And what's going to make the sky look better? Is it going to be brightness? Maybe. Brightness is a mid-tone adjustment, so that's only affecting the mid-tones. So that's bringing out this area a bit. Is contrast going to help? Not really, so that's no good. Is clarity going to help? Yep, that's going to bring it out nicely. And what about this kind of darker area? I want to make that a little bit darker, so maybe I can use a curve. So right now we've got some clarity and some brightness. So let's grab my curve picker and go over to the area that I want to change. Now you'll see as I move this slowly around, look at the orange line that's popping up on the curve tool. That shows me the exact tonal range that I want to edit. So if I click once, that sets me a point on the curve. So now I can bring this down, and there we go. That's getting some drama back in the sky. But I'm going to probably overcook it a little bit. So now we've got a combo of 3 different adjustments, essentially. But that's affecting the foreground, which I don't want, and it's maybe a bit too much. So I'm going to right click and say clear mask. Grab our brush, make this a bit bigger and softer, nice low flow, and now I can just kind of sketch in the areas that I want to have, for example. Okay, so a little bit up here. I'm kind of following the patterns of the clouds, if you like. A little bit more in the corner, a little bit over here, some there, and a bit more in the corner, and a bit along here as well, like so. If we turn this layer off, you can see before and after. For Dan, let's have a look at the grayscale mask. There it is. So it's got some variation and subtlety and so on as well. There we go. So again, a combination of adjustments which made sense for that shot, and flow just allowing to build it up nice and easily. Now, I believe it might have been on Facebook and YouTube, I'm not sure, about drawing kind of more accurate masks, if you like. Generally, I don't find much reason for myself to draw super accurate masks. So let's go to this shot again. I'm going to make a new layer, turn off my proof view. Let's go to 100%. So let's say, okay, I want to, darken the sky, for example. Could I, mask just this sky area? You could, but I don't think it would be the best technique. So if we grab our brush, right click, let's get flow on 100 and turn on auto mask, you'll see we get a circle in the center, which is my sample zone. So if I start masking along this edge, as soon as I let go, anything in that central circle, which is different to the first outer circle, will not be masked. So if I draw along here, for example, see it just disappeared, like so. So now you can kind of cut your way along an edge. So let's just go all the way up here, and round here and so on. Now I find this kind of relatively laborious and soul destroying and eventually what I have to do is then we would need to, let's just take auto mask off, then what I would do would just be fill in the rest. We can use a handy shortcut and right click and say fill mask, and that would just fill the hole in the center like so. So then we've got a mask which kind of cut quite nicely around the edge. But generally when you do that, if I just change exposure right away, it's really obvious that I've made that kind of very hard cut off between the skyscape. It just doesn't look accurate. Whereas if I had, let's delete that layer, if I'd done a gradient, something like this, and changed it to be asymmetric, and got this kind of fall off, and then made a change, it instantly becomes a lot more believable. Because light doesn't really work like that. It doesn't cut its way around kind of fine edges. Where it can be useful is something like interior photography, where you want to cut around a window and then just change the exposure. And if you do want to do that, that makes more sense. And a little trick you can do, if you make yourself a very hard edge brush, I'll do it bigger than you would expect. But if I draw a point and hold my shift key down and click once, we can actually draw shapes like so. So if you need to cut around, you know, a window or a piece of furniture, you can just shift click to make straight lines like so. But generally, the softer, kind of fluffier the mask is, and if we look at our grayscale mask again, the softer and more subtle it is, the much more believable it comes as well. So Dan, yes, for real estate work, I think that's a good use case. But otherwise, not so much. Okay, I'm glad you said that, Dan, because I think that's really where it comes into its own. Alrighty, rasterize, don't worry, Maya on YouTube. We can pick that up again as well. Other layer types we're going to get to, Bill, don't panic. Can you go out of bounds with the brush? So as I said, what makes sense if you do need to go out of bounds, and we can, so let's just soften this up again, then I can do like so, but it helps to turn this proof mode on so that you can paint around the edge of a shot like so. Now the size of that, excuse me, proof mode, we can actually change in the preferences. So if we look at, where is it? Appearance, yeah, proof margin like so, and margin here. So proof margin, we can make it as big or as small as you like, and it just helps if you need to mask on those underlying areas. Also, mask color you can change here. So if you don't like red, then you can change it to luminous green or whatever you like. Cool. Okay, so I hope that helps. Let's just have a look in the Q&A. Andre's beavering away in the background, answering a lot of questions, so thank you. Dave says, how does fill mask command behave if the outline is less? So if I'd drawn a, let's just get rid of that amazing mask. Let's make a new one. I think, Dave, if we set opacity to 40% and I just draw a mask like so, if I say fill mask, it should fill to the opacity of the outline. Yes, it does. So I hope that answers your question, Dave. Let's delete that and let's move on to a really brilliant shot, which I can't claim as my own, I'm afraid. So here's the shot out of camera. This I picked up on a Reddit discussion. So Reddit, the sort of discussion news site, etc. There's a Capture One group out there. And this shot was posted by a guy called Farzan, who's out in Beijing, I believe. And he did this really nice blog post which showed you how he went from this to this, which is quite a dramatic improvement, as I'm sure you can understand. On Monday on Facebook and YouTube at 3:30 Europe time, I'll go through the whole process. But what I want to show on this particular shot is how he used the luminosity mask, because it's such a good example. So I'm going to go to this version, which is kind of his basic edits, but with no layers. So let's hide the browser and let's talk about Luma Range. So what Luma Range masking does, is create the mask based on luminosity levels, so brightness levels. Now, the really important thing to get into your head is exactly how the Luma Range mask works, or the parameters, if you like, that it needs to work. So the Luma Range sets a constraint on a mask that you have already drawn. So you can see right now that if we press Luma Range, nothing happens. So it's not working. Why? Because there's no mask to put the Luma Range constraint on, for example. So we first need to create a mask to place our Luma Range constraint. So the way I prefer to do it is simply to start with a new filled layer. So let's do that. That's going to fill the whole shot, and we're going to call this foreground, for example. And right now, obviously it's covering the whole photo, but what we want to do is say, okay, I just want the foreground to be restricted. So let's turn that back on, and now we're going to hit Luma Range, and this brings up this tool, which might look a little bit on the scary side, but it's actually pretty logical in the way it's used. So at the top, you can see our luminosity range. Capture One will just churn away for a little bit at the start, building kind of a luminosity map to help the tool work quicker. Now, I just want to cover the sort of darker tones at the front. So if I take the range and bring this to this direction, you can see gradually it sort of peels away until we get to the kind of area that I want to adjust, like so. Now at the bottom, this is the fall off, how we kind of roll off into the neighboring tones. So if I make this hard stop, then you see we end up with a very binary mask like so. If we bring this out, then that kind of bleeds off into those other areas much nicer. Now we're going to come back to radius and sensitivity like so and look at how those work in a second. But for now, I'm going to say apply mask. Press M on my keyboard to bring that back, and then now we're free to do whatever we want in that particular area. So Derek, or our Derek, seems to think it's too fake, but of course we can go as little as far as we like with this. So I can bring in the level, so let's back it off a bit for Derek's benefit, and we can also bring in the clarity a little bit as well, and also it's super sharp. It's do you want to go on that bridge? Fairly terrifying, I would say. Let's bring in a bit of structure just to that area too. So that's popping out all the details really nicely, but it's seamlessly running off into the back. So again, it's not obvious at all that we've put a mask on that particular area. Let's chuck in a bit of saturation too. So really super nice editing job. Now the nice thing is that this is dynamic. So you see we've got the sunlight icon sticking up, so I can go back into Luma Range at any point, turn on my mask, and just tweak this as I feel fit. Now you might prefer, which I do, is to look at this in the grayscale mask, because I think it's easier to visualize what's going on. So again, if we turn Luma Range back on, you can see exactly what's happening like so. Now underneath we've got radius and sensitivity, and this deals with the edge of the mask. So if we just zoom into 100% for a second, so you see that the edge, it's pretty hard here, like so. So again, there's not much kind of subtlety or roll off or something like that. So can we modify the mask to make it look a bit more natural, for example? So we could try a couple of things. Let's right click and say feather the mask, so to soften the edge. So if we click on feather the mask, bump this up to 100, wait for the progress bar to finish, like so. Oh, nothing's happened. Should you not think that the edge is going to feather? No, because what are we doing? We're feathering our filled mask, which is covering the whole shot. Remember, we're getting a Luma constraint on the mask that we applied. So feather mask, all it's doing is feathering the edge of my filled mask. So that's not going to work. So let's cancel out of that. We could try the same thing. We could say, okay, let's refine the mask. Let's put this up to maximum. Wait for it to complete. Hang on a minute, same thing again, nothing's happening because we're trying to refine the edge of my field mask. So that's no good. Fortunately, in the Luma Range tool itself, we have those very possibilities down here in the radius and sensitivity. Now, radius and sensitivity, the sensitivity will have no effect when radius is at 0. So the more I bring up the radius, the greater the adjustment is going to go over to the edges of the mask. So bringing that radius up, you see how the mask has just blended a bit nicer into the surroundings of that mountain. Now, if you want to feather, you go sensitivity to 0, feathering straight away. If you want to refine, which means kind of suck around the edges of the mask, then we can go to 100. And then that will just fit perfectly around the shot like so. How does that look? So let's go, let's turn off the mask. So now if we go to 0, see that looks a little bit more natural because it's almost like a mist kind of wrapping around the edge of the mountain. Derek, hope you approve. If we go to 100, then you can see it's a little bit harder, like so. Now, depending on the subject at hand, you might prefer to have a feathered mask, or we might prefer to have a refined mask. If we zoom out, for example, oops, let's just turn that off. If we zoom out, let's bring Luma Range back up, sorry. So that's refined, so really following the edges carefully. If we go down to 0, that's going to feather, which I think is just a little bit nicer. It just looks a little bit more natural. So if we turn this layer off, so that's before and after, like so. And also I love this file because it's such a good exercise in, you know, if you saw that raw file come out your camera, you think, blimey, I'm a bit disappointed with that. That's not how I remembered it. And then we can go from that to that. And of course, depending on your personal taste, we can, you know, go more contrasty. We can bring back, you know, more of the color, or, you know, whatever you like. You've got all that flexibility there, but it was made much easier by the ability to use that nice luminosity mask. Now, the what's the word? The danger is you think, wow, luminosity masks are great, which they are, and you think I must use it on every single image I have. It's not necessary. Works perfectly on this shot. It's just super applicable for it. But on some cases, it can be, overkill. It's not necessary. You can get away with just doing a gradient mask or a quick, you know, mask or whatever as well. But it's a really nice feature to know it's there. Now, I started off by doing a filled mask, but remember, it can put a constraint on any kind of mask. So even if I just grab my brush and I did this, for example, so if I just drew a mask like this, roughly around the edge, or just at the front, something like that, and we said Luma Range, the exact same thing would be able to happen as well. So you can start with a filled mask, you can start with a brush mask, you can also put a Luma constraint on top of a gradient if you wish. So if we'd done, let's delete that, if we'd grabbed a gradient and we'd done that, for example, I can Luma Range a gradient and get a similar kind of effect as well. And then actually that would bleed up kind of seamlessly into that point. So that would give us, you know, different potential. Let's turn that one off. So now we've got this one. We could throw in some clarity. Where's my levels gone? Let's bring in the levels, for example, and up the saturation as well. So now we've got a different look where the mist is just kind of still hanging on the mountain. So if you prefer it like that, or we could have that, endless potential. So that's a Luma Range on top of a gradient mask. Now, rasterizing, as we spoke about, if we press M on the keyboard and I wanted to, you know, add to a bit of the mask. So if I start brushing, it says, do you want to rasterize the mask? So that means it's going to stick the mask as it is. So I can either say yes, okay to that dialog and do it. Because if I tried to add to it, I can't, because it has that luma range constraint on it. But now as soon as I say rasterize, that mask is now as if I drew it by hand. That's a good way to think about it. So now I can add up here, which I wouldn't want to, but it now sort of behaves exactly like a normal mask, for example. So that's what rasterize does. It takes your linear gradient, your radial gradient, your luma range mask, and sticks it as it is. So I hope that makes sense. Let's have a looky look. The Luma mask did more than salving the image. It made it outstanding. It's a really great shot, isn't it? I'm so pleased that Farzan made this blog post. And as I said, I'll run through the whole edit on Monday, and he wrote all his steps out in a blog post as well, which I'll share on Monday too. And you can also download his raw file if you want to try it yourself. So it's just so nice that you can go from this to that, or we could do this version, endless possibilities. I might quite like that because it's just got a bit of mist hanging over the rocks as well. So many different possibilities. All right, so let's see what we've got going on in the questions. Just having a look. Can you unrasterize? You can undo. So if I rasterized, I could just go back and say undo if you remember to do it straight away, but you can't reverse it, unfortunately. Christopher says, this type of stuff is what we're here for. That's great. Yep. It's perfect. Yeah, it just, again, perfect image to demonstrate this. Looking at the Q&A, sorry. Luma masks are good for color grading various tones. That's great. So if you want to just throw in a color grade to, the very darkest shadows, I know the color balance tool has that separation anyway, but if you want to restrict it even further, it's perfect for that as well. So that's a great tip as well. Let's have a look. Am I going to show any layers on portrait shooting? Well, if you go back to the last webinar about color, there's a bit about skin tone in there as well, which tends to be where we use layers. So for this one, because we've done quite a lot of people in the past, I was sticking with these kinds of shots. But don't forget, any of the techniques you can see here. Doesn't matter if you shoot cats, dogs, landscapes, people, technique is the same. It can just be applied. Okay, let's have a look. What's the reasons to rasterize in practice? That's a good question, John. Well, it could be, let's say we had a rogue bit of mask up here. Let's say there was another mountain sticking up or something. And of course, no matter what we did with Luma range, we couldn't get rid of it. Then we could rasterize and erase it or whatever. So there's a few practical uses like that, for example. Okay, let's see. Mike, just on Facebook, says, can you repeat how you did that magic selection? The magic selection, Mike, just remember, create a mask and click Luma range like so. Make sure you see the mask, and then you can restrict it to whatever you like. So it's just a really super nice tool. Now, depending on the speed of your computer, sometimes it's better to just let it build its luminosity map before you start pulling the sliders, and then that way it will just let it catch up a little bit. Cool, alrighty. How are we doing for time? Oh, goodness. Got to blast through the last bit. Oh, these ones are easy. So style as a layer, this is just a good handy thing to know. So if you want to work with styles on your photos, but find the styles are maybe too strong, or just not necessarily apply well to a particular photo, when you're running down your styles, so as I'm clicking through and thinking, okay, maybe let's say I like this style, but it's, it's 20% too heavy, if you like. So if I right click and say apply to new layer, then what happens is that we end up with a style layer, which we can turn on and off. And the great thing is, because it's a field mask, like so, we can punch holes in it if we wish, or we could back the opacity off, like so. Or in this case, I could take my erase brush on a nice low flow, and then because it's a bit heavy-handed in the cavern, I could just take a little bit of the style out, like so. So simple. So it just makes every style that bit more applicable. So it's often tricky to get, you know, the best application of a style across many photos, but adding it as a layer works much better. So that was a quick and easy one. Color grading. So this handsome chap here. So what I tend to do is make a new filled layer, which is our color grade. And the nice thing is that we can combine several different tools together. So let's say I want to color grade this. So I'm on my filled mask, if I remember. Yep. So it's kind of like an adjustment layer. So I'm just going to have some colder shadows. Let's warm up the midtones. Let's darken the shadows a bit. And let's brighten our highlights. Let's also, in our color editor, let's pick his beard, take the saturation out of that a bit, make that a bit darker, and then also let's pull out saturation a bit too. So now I've got a color grade layer, as you can see. Now if I want to, again, I can take the opacity down, which means I'm lessening the effect of all those different adjustments at once. So if I'd done this on the background and felt, you know, it's a bit too much, I'd have to go back and tweak this. Then I'd have to go into my color balance tool. Where are you? Color balance. And then, you know, play with this a little bit and so on. Whereas if it's on a layer, then we can just kind of dial in exactly the look that we want to have. So color grading on a layer is a super tip. Oh, last thing that we need to cover, which I didn't make a collection. So let's take these four dudes, for example. Let's just make a new album for a second. Just call this copy apply. So I just want 4 shots so it's easier to look at. So let's say if we take, let's do a similar thing. So I'm going to make a new filled layer, which is going to be our color grading layer, for example, and we're going to do a super speedy color grade. Like that looks pretty bad, like we did before, but we're also going to back off the saturation. So I've got my kind of vintagey looking color grade going on, and I also want to have a radial mask. So I'm going to grab my radial tool, throw in my vignette to something like that. Whoops, undo, missed the edge, to something like that. And we're going to back off brightness just to darken that down a little bit and maybe bring that in. Okay, so we've got 2 layers. We've got our radial and we've got our color grade, and I want to get that across to the other photos. So if I shift select all of them and we hit the copy and apply arrow in the layers tool itself, then it shows me what layers do you want to copy across. Do I want to do the radial and the grade, or just the grade, for example? So if I uncheck that and do apply, then it does my grade, but it's missed out the radial. So I could go back and say, actually, that was silly of me. I want to do the radial and say apply like so. So now on this one, I've got my radial and grade as we speak, like so. So just be aware when you click copy and apply in layers, you can pick and choose what layer adjustments you want to have. Whew, there we go. Shortcuts, that was the last thing. So everything that you've seen today can be applied or can be actioned with a shortcut, if you like. So if you go to your edit keyboard shortcuts and just type in layer, that's by far the easiest way to find it, and you can see all the layer actions you can do with the shortcut. Some of them have a default, some don't, so you can make your own keyboard shortcut set to do so. So adding a new empty layer, adding an adjustment layer, changing opacity, so on and so forth. There's also brush shortcuts as well. So if I type brush, we've got size, hardness, opacity, and flow as well. So just type those in so you can find those easily. So once again, layer, so we can see that. Good question from Hannah, but I'm going to disappoint you. Can you save layer adjustments as a style? Sadly, not currently. That's not because we don't think it's a good idea. It's just the way the sort of engineering underneath of Capture One works, it's not possible currently, but that doesn't mean it's not a good suggestion. Let's have a look. Barry says, would love to see a session on organising and sorting. That's actually coming up April 30th. That's about organising your catalogue. So come back for then, Barry. It's like we read your mind. Is there a printed version of shortcuts on the web? There's one right in Capture One. So if you click on Summarise, that will open a web page and show you all the shortcuts like so, which you can then print out. So just click Summarise and it will go straight to a web page like so. Let's see. I think Gustavo, we answered your question. So yes, you can copy paste a layer you've created in different photos. So I think that answered that. Oh, reminder on the healing layer. Very simple. Let's go to this shot and let's see if I've managed to keep the same one. So very simply, if you want to heal a spot, let's find, so let's say we want to get rid of that leaf. All we do is you grab, you make a new heal layer, so it's a different kind. You grab your brush, you hold Alt down to sample a point, like so. So that's sampled that point, and then I just need to brush over here, and then it will heal like so. So Option click to sample a point. Now the caveat is that you can only have one sample point per layer. So if you need to do lots and lots and lots of kind of healing, then you're best off in Affinity Photo or Photoshop or something like that. But for simple removal of objects like that, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm not sure if there was any questions came through on Facebook. I don't know if my comments feed is working correctly on that. So if we've missed you on Facebook, I do apologize. But hopefully that's still ticking away nicely in the background. Last thing that I should point out is that, I'm just seeing if it's still in the webinar. Yep, you've got that upgrade offer. So for those of you on any version of Capture One, like Capture One 12, 11, 10, and you want to upgrade, then you can see at the top of the chat, kind of above or to the right of me, you can see the upgrade 30 offer. So that takes 30% off any upgrade in the store. You need to log in to see what's available, and that's running up until the end of April, I believe. So getting quick before that goes away. So I think that brings us up pretty much to the end. Do join us again on tomorrow, actually. So if you want to come back tomorrow at 3:30 European time, then we're just going to do a little focus on color grading. So the sort of speed color grade edit that you saw, and you'll see us. And then the next webinar is April 30th for Barry, which is about organizing your catalog and a few other bits and pieces as well. So hope you found today useful. The recording will be up probably tonight or first thing tomorrow, so you can always go back and check it out again. So thanks again for joining today, and see you all later. Have a good one. Take care, and thanks to Andre as well for beavering away in the background answering a million questions. So take care and see you all soon. Bye now.